I never imagined that a quiet Tuesday morning would turn into the day I locked an entire neighborhood out of their own homes. It started with a knock at my door, the kind that isn't friendly or casual, but firm, repetitive, and impatient. When I opened it, a man in a bright orange vest stood there holding a clipboard, pointing behind me as if he already owned the place. Before I could even ask what he wanted, he said, "You need to move your truck. Construction crews will be coming through here all day." Through here. That's when the confusion hit me. Because here wasn't a street. It wasn't a shared driveway. It wasn't a public road. It was my property. I laughed at first. I honestly thought he had the wrong house. But then he pointed past my fence to a line of heavy equipment rumbling in the distance. Bulldozers, trucks, men in hard hats setting up cones like they'd done this 100 times before. He spoke like this was routine, like it had been happening for weeks. Except nobody had ever told me. I asked who gave them permission to use my land as an access road. His answer was so casual it almost didn't register. The HOA. That one sentence changed everything. I don't live in the HOA. I never signed their paperwork. I never agreed to their rules. My property sits right next to their neighborhood, but legally and clearly, it has always been separate. Private land. My land. Yet somehow, somewhere along the line, they decided it was easier to use my driveway as the main entrance for their big renovation project instead of building a proper road. And they never even asked. Over the next hour, I watched in disbelief as truck after truck rolled across the edge of my property. Deep tire tracks carved into the dirt. Dust clouds drifting toward my porch. Workers waving like this was normal. Like I was supposed to smile and let it happen. That was the moment the tension really set in. Because I realized something chilling. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This had been planned, scheduled, approved. Someone in that HOA had made the decision that my land was just convenient. And convenience, apparently, mattered more than ownership. So I started asking questions. I called the HOA office. I checked county records. I pulled up property maps. Every answer I got made the situation worse. Nobody could show me a signed agreement. Nobody could explain why my property had suddenly become their construction entrance. Yet the trucks kept coming. By the third day, the damage to my driveway was obvious. Ruts, cracks, mud dragged across the pavement. And every time I stepped outside, more vehicles rolled through like they were entitled to it. That's when I realized something else. If they believed they had the right to use my property without asking, what would happen if I took that access away? And that's the exact moment I decided to do something that would stop the entire neighborhood in its tracks. Literally. The next morning, before sunrise, I walked down to the only entrance they had been using, and I locked it. The chain clicked shut louder than I expected. It echoed in the quiet morning air like a starting gun. For the first time in days, there were no engines rumbling, no backup alarms beeping, no dust clouds rolling toward my porch. Just silence and a strange feeling that I'd cross a line I couldn't uncross. I stood there staring at the locked gate, half expecting someone to appear immediately and tell me I couldn't do this. No one came. The neighborhood behind the tree line remained still, like it hadn't realized yet that its main construction access had just disappeared. But I knew the calm wouldn't last long, because the truth was this situation hadn't appeared overnight. The signs had been there for months. I just hadn't understood what they meant. It started subtly. At first, I noticed survey flags popping up along the edge of the property line. Bright orange and pink strips fluttering in the wind like tiny warning signs I didn't know how to read. I figured a neighbor was planting a fence, or maybe the city was checking utilities. It didn't seem like my business. Then came the letters. Not addressed to me, never to me, but to resident. Glossy mailers about a major community improvement project in the adjacent neighborhood. New roads, upgraded drainage, expanded homes. The kind of language designed to sound exciting and harmless. I tossed them into the recycling bin without a second thought. After all, I wasn't part of that homeowners association. Their projects weren't my projects. Their rules weren't my rules. That distance had always been one of the reasons I bought this place in the first place. Quiet land. No HOA fees, no meetings, no committees telling me what color my mailbox should be. Freedom. Or at least, that's what I thought I had. The first time I noticed something truly off was 3 weeks before the construction truck showed up. I came home late and saw tire marks cutting across the very edge of my driveway. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough to look intentional, like someone testing a shortcut. I remember standing there in the fading light, staring at those tracks, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a delivery truck had turned around. Maybe someone got lost. But the tracks appeared again the next day, and the day after that. Looking back now, it feels obvious. Like the beginning of a story everyone else already knew the ending to. What bothers me most isn't just the damage to my property. It's the realization that decisions were being made about my land without me even being part of the conversation. Somewhere in some meeting room, people had maps spread across a table. They had timelines, budgets, and construction schedules. And apparently, my driveway had become a convenient solution. A shortcut that saved them time. A shortcut that saved them money. A shortcut they assumed I'd never notice until it was too late. By the time the gate clicked shut, I had already spent nights scrolling through county records and zoning maps, trying to understand how this could even happen. Every document I found confirmed the same thing. There was no easement, no shared access agreement, no legal permission, which meant one thing. The entire construction project behind those trees had been relying on access they didn't actually have. And sooner or later, someone from the HOA was going to realize the road they depended on had just disappeared. By mid-morning, the silence broke exactly the way I knew it would. First came the distant rumble of engines. Then the metallic clatter of equipment slowing to a stop somewhere beyond the trees. I watched from my kitchen window, coffee untouched, heart beating faster with every passing second. It felt like waiting for a storm you can see rolling in from miles away. My phone rang before anyone knocked. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Hi, this is the HOA office. We've been informed you placed a lock on the construction access road this morning. Not your gate, not your property, just construction access road, as if the name alone made it official. I told them exactly what I had discovered. No easement, no agreement, no permission. My voice sounded steadier than my hands felt. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to imagine someone covering the receiver and whispering to a room full of people. Then the tone shifted. Well, the woman said carefully, this project is extremely important to the community. Blocking access is going to cause serious delays and financial impact. Financial impact. The phrase hung in the air like a quiet accusation. Suddenly, the problem wasn't trucks damaging my property. It was me damaging their schedule. That was the first moment the guilt crept in. Because here's the part one hadn't admitted to anyone yet. I don't like conflict. I avoid it whenever I can. I'm the kind of person who apologizes when someone bumps into me. The kind who returns shopping carts from the far end of the parking lot. Locking that gate felt completely out of character. And now an entire neighborhood was waiting behind it. After the call ended, I walked outside and stood near the fence line. Through the trees, I could hear voices. Frustrated, confused. Someone revved an engine and shut it off again, like they were hoping the gate might magically open if they waited long enough. I imagined workers standing around checking their watches, project managers making phone calls, maybe even homeowners wondering why their renovation suddenly stopped. The moral dilemma hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't just blocking trucks anymore. I was blocking people's plans, people's money, people's expectations. And that uncomfortable realization was exactly what the HOA seemed to be counting on. By noon, the email started. Not aggressive, not threatening, just carefully worded messages about cooperation and community spirit. They thanked me for my patience during the construction project, language that subtly assumed I had already agreed to be patient. One email included a phrase that made my stomach drop. We've been using this access point for weeks without issue. Without issue. The implication was clear. If it hadn't been a problem before, why was it suddenly a problem now? I reread that sentence at least 10 times, each time feeling more unsettled. Because technically they were right. For weeks, trucks had crossed the edge of my property before I fully understood what was happening. For weeks, I hadn't stopped them. Had my silence somehow become permission? That question kept circling in my head like a mosquito I couldn't swat. Late that afternoon, a man appeared at the gate. Not in a construction vest this time. This guy wore pressed khakis and sunglasses, the kind of outfit that screams, "I handle problems for a living." He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He just stood there examining the chain like a puzzle he was confident he could solve. When he noticed me watching from the porch, he gave a polite wave and walked closer, stopping a few feet from the fence. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm on the HOA board." The HOA board. Hearing the words out loud made everything suddenly feel more official and more intimidating. He spoke calmly, like we were discussing weather instead of property rights. He talked about timelines, contractors, budgets, about how complicated it would be to reroute access now, how expensive it would be to build a new road, how much the community was counting on this project staying on schedule. Every sentence sounded reasonable, logical, carefully chosen. And then he said the one thing that made my chest tighten. "We assumed this wouldn't be an issue." Assumed, not confirmed, not agreed upon. Assumed. As he spoke, I realized something unsettling. They weren't panicking. They weren't angry. They were confident, like this situation was temporary, like they believed the gate would open again soon, one way or another. When he finally left, the quiet returned, heavier than before. Because for the first time, I started wondering if locking the gate had started something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute, something that wasn't going to stay polite for long. The next morning, the knocking came before sunrise. Not a polite knock, not a neighborly tap. This was sharp, urgent, the kind of knock that pulls you out of sleep with your heart already racing. I opened the door to find two construction supervisors standing on the porch, both holding phones like they were ready to document everything. Behind them, down the road, a long line of trucks sat idling in the dim blue light of early morning. Headlights cutting through the fog, engines rumbling impatiently. The gate had officially become a problem. "None of our crews can get in," one of them said, voice tight. "We've got a full schedule today." I told them the same thing I had told everyone else. No easement, no permission, no access. They exchanged a look that felt heavier than words. Not angry, not surprised, just resigned. Like this was no longer a conversation they expected to win at the front door. By the time they left, I knew what was coming next. Paperwork. By noon, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Thick, official, the kind that instantly makes your stomach drop before you even open it. My name printed cleanly across the front. Inside was a letter from the HOA's legal team. Not a threat, not exactly, but close enough that my hand shook while I read it. It talked about shared historical use, about community reliance, about good faith access established over time. The words felt carefully engineered, legal language designed to blur the line between permission and assumption. Their argument was simple, but chilling. Because the construction vehicles had been using the path for weeks, the HOA believed the access had become reasonably expected. Reasonably expected. I read that phrase over and over again, feeling the weight of it sink in. They weren't claiming ownership of my property. Not outright. They were claiming something quieter, something harder to fight. Expectation. That evening, I walked the length of the fence as the sun dipped low behind the trees. The chain on the gate glinted in the fading light. It looked smaller now, less powerful, like a thin line trying to hold back something much bigger than itself. For the first time, doubt crept in hard. What if they didn't need permission the way I thought they did? What if silence really could turn into access? I hated how convincing the letter sounded. Hated how the language made me feel like the unreasonable one. Like the person causing delays, costs, stress. The person standing in the way of an entire neighborhood's plans. And then the phone rang again. This time, the number wasn't unknown. It was a neighbor, a woman who lived at the very edge of the HOA community. We'd spoken a few times over the years. Friendly waves. Small talk about weather and property lines. Nothing serious. Her voice sounded hesitant. Careful. "I heard about the gate," she said. I braced myself, but she didn't sound angry. She sounded worried. She explained that the construction project wasn't just cosmetic. The neighborhood had drainage issues, flooding during heavy rain. The new road and upgrades were supposed to fix it before the next storm season. People had invested money, taken out loans, planned renovations around timeline. They're saying the project might stop if access isn't restored soon. The guilt hit harder than ever, because suddenly the story wasn't about trucks and tire tracks anymore. It was about families, homes, flood risks, money already spent, people counting on a solution. When the call ended, the quiet around my house felt suffocating. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind in the trees, the creak of the porch boards, the faint hum of engines still waiting beyond the gate. They hadn't left. Even in the dark, they were still parked down the road, waiting, watching, expecting the gate to open. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the letter, the phone calls, the conversations. Every argument pulling me in a different direction. Property rights, community impact, legal language, moral responsibility. Around midnight, headlights swept across my bedroom wall. A car pulling up slowly, stopping near the gate. I stepped to the window and peeked through the blinds. Two vehicles, doors opening, silhouettes moving in the darkness. Flashlights flickering to life, beams cutting across the chain and lock. They weren't knocking this time. They weren't calling. They were inspecting, measuring. One of the figures crouched near the gate, shining a light directly on the lock like it was an obstacle that needed solving. My stomach dropped, because in that moment, a realization hit me with chilling clarity. They weren't trying to convince me anymore. They were trying to figure out how long the gate would stay closed. I barely slept after the late-night inspection at the gate. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every passing car made me sit up and listen. By morning, the silence felt wrong again, like the calm before something official happened. It didn't take long. At 9:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification from the county records website I'd signed up for days earlier. At first, I almost ignored it. I expected another boring zoning update or generic notice. Instead, the subject line made my stomach drop. New filing affecting your property. I opened it standing in the kitchen, still holding my coffee. Halfway through the first paragraph, the mug slipped from my hand and shattered across the floor. Someone had filed paperwork claiming a temporary construction access easement on my property, dated 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks. Before I locked the gate. Before the emails. Before the legal letter. Before the HOA board member stood in my yard, smiling like this was all a misunderstanding. This wasn't a response to the gate. This had already been in motion. My heart pounded as I read the filing again and again, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't approved yet. It wasn't finalized. But the request was there, sitting in the county system like a quiet landmine waiting to go off. They hadn't been trying to convince me. They had been buying time. Suddenly, every conversation replayed in my head differently. The polite emails, the careful language, the calm HOA board member, the legal letter about reasonable expectation. It wasn't negotiation. It was strategy. And then came the part that hit hardest. The filing included supporting statements from neighboring residents confirming long-term access use. Neighboring residents. I scrolled down the document slowly, dread building with every inch of text. The first name meant nothing to me. The second one didn't either. The third name made my chest tighten. It was the woman who had called me the night before. The same woman who had sounded worried, sympathetic, understanding. The one who had talked about flooding and families and how important the project was. Her statement said the construction vehicles had been using the path regularly and without objection. Without objection. The words blurred as I stared at the screen. A wave of emotions hit all at once. Confusion, anger, disbelief. Not because she wanted the project to continue. I understood that. But because of the timing. Because she had called me after the filing was already submitted. After she had already supported it. That conversation replayed in my head with new meaning. The careful tone, the gentle guilt, the subtle pressure. It hadn't just been a worried neighbor calling to talk. It had been someone making sure the gate stayed open long enough. I didn't even realize I had been pacing the kitchen until my phone rang again. This time, it was the HOA board member. "I assume you've seen the filing," he said calmly, like we were discussing the weather again. The calmness in his voice felt different now. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't persuading. He sounded confident. He explained that the easement request would allow the project to continue legally while the county reviewed the situation. Temporary, he said, just until the road was completed. Temporary. But the more he talked, the more I realized what it meant. If approved, the gate wouldn't matter anymore. The lock wouldn't matter. My decision wouldn't matter. The access would become official. Of course, he added gently, it would go much smoother if we could avoid a formal dispute. Avoid a dispute. The phrase lingered long after the call ended, because suddenly the timeline felt real. Urgent. Ticking. This wasn't a neighborhood disagreement anymore. It wasn't emails and conversations and polite smiles. It was paperwork, filings, statements, a process already moving forward. And for the first time since I locked the gate, a terrifying possibility settled in. What if the decision about my property had already been made and I was the last person to realize it? The county hearing was scheduled faster than I expected. 2 weeks. That was all the time I had before someone in a quiet office would decide whether my driveway officially became the neighborhood's construction road. Those 14 days felt like living inside a countdown clock. Every morning, I checked the gate first. Every night, I double-checked the lock. The trucks still waited down the road, a daily reminder that time was running out. But something had changed in me after reading that filing. The guilt was still there. The doubt, too. But now it sat beside something stronger, clarity. This wasn't about being difficult. This wasn't about blocking progress. This was about the simple fact that decisions about my property had been made without me from the very beginning. And if I didn't speak now, the silence they had relied on would become permanent. The hearing took place in a small county conference room that felt far too quiet for something that had consumed my life for weeks. A long table, stacks of documents, neutral walls that didn't care who was right. Across the room sat the HOA representatives, their attorney, and the board member who had stood at my gate days earlier. He gave me the same polite nod, the same calm smile. But this time, I didn't feel intimidated, because I wasn't walking in empty-handed. I had spent every night gathering records, photos of the tire damage, property maps, zoning documents, timeline screenshots, emails, phone logs, every detail from the moment the first tire mark appeared. And one more thing, something I almost didn't notice while digging through old files. It was buried in the original development plans for the HOA neighborhood, documents filed years before I bought my property, pages of maps and proposals and construction phases. On the very last page of one old planning map, there was a thin dotted line drawn from the main road toward the back of the neighborhood, a proposed access road that was never built. Next to it, a small handwritten note scanned into the file. Future access route pending budget approval. The road they were supposed to build had always been part of the plan. They just never paid for it. When it was my turn to speak, my voice shook at first. Then it steadied. I walked through the timeline. The lack of an easement, the damage, the emails, the filing, the statements, and finally, the map. I slid the printed page across the table. Silence filled the room as the county official leaned forward to read the note. The shift in the room was almost physical, like air pressure changing before a storm. For the first time since this began, the HOA attorney didn't immediately speak, because suddenly the story looked different. This wasn't a community unexpectedly needing access. This was a community that had planned its own road and quietly chosen not to build it, choosing instead the cheaper option. My driveway. The decision didn't come immediately. The official asked questions, took notes, reviewed documents. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. And then the words finally came. The temporary easement request was denied. No legal right of access. The gate could remain locked. Relief hit so hard it felt like my knees might give out. Weeks of tension released all at once, leaving behind a strange mix of exhaustion and disbelief. It was over, or at least I thought it was. 3 days later, construction equipment returned, but not to my gate. To the edge of the HOA property. I watched from my porch as crews began clearing land deeper inside the neighborhood, carving a new path through trees and dirt. The road they should have built from the beginning was finally being created. It took another week before the HOA board member came back to my door. No clipboard this time. No rehearsed speech. Just a quiet apology. He admitted the truth in a way the legal letters never had. The project budget had been stretched thin, and using my property had seemed like a temporary solution that would save time and money. They thought I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't fight it. As he turned to leave, he added one last thing that stopped me in the doorway. "We actually had a vote about building that road years ago," he said. "It failed by one vote." One vote. I stood there long after he walked away, staring at the now quiet gate. Because the biggest twist of all wasn't the legal fight, or the filing, or the hearing. It was the realization that this entire battle, weeks of stress, legal paperwork, and sleepless nights, had started years earlier, with a single decision made in a room I wasn't even in. For the first time in weeks, the mornings felt quiet again. No Indians, no flashing lights through the trees, no emails waiting in my inbox before I'd even poured coffee. Just the familiar stillness that had made me fall in love with this place in the first place. The gate stayed locked for a while after the county decision, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit. It had become a symbol of everything that had happened. A reminder of how quickly assumptions can turn into plans, and how easily silence can be mistaken for agreement. Eventually, one afternoon, I walked down and unlocked it. Not because anyone asked me to, not because anyone needed access anymore. The new road inside the neighborhood was nearly finished by then, and the construction traffic had moved permanently off my property. The trucks that once lined the road each morning were gone, replaced by birds and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The conflict that once felt enormous now existed only in tire marks slowly fading from the dirt. But the emotional part didn't disappear as quickly. For weeks after the hearing, I kept thinking about the people behind the emails, the phone calls, and the statements. The neighbor who had called me with worry in her voice. The board member who finally admitted the truth. The workers who had just been trying to do their jobs. Even the residents who feared flooding and had invested money in improvements they believed were urgent. Nobody in this story saw themselves as the villain. That realization took the longest to settle. The woman who signed a statement eventually stopped by one evening while I was working in the yard. She looked nervous, like someone rehearsing an apology in her head. We stood by the fence line and talked for a long time, not about paperwork or filings or easements, but about storms, repairs, and how fast misunderstandings can grow when nobody sits down to talk early. She admitted she felt pressured to support the access request. Not forced, just swept up in the urgency of the project and the fear of delays. When the HOA framed the situation as temporary and harmless, it sounded reasonable at the time. Hearing that didn't erase the sting, but it softened it. Because the truth was, I had learned something uncomfortable about myself too. I had assumed the HOA didn't care about me, that they were faceless decision-makers choosing convenience over fairness. But in reality, there were people juggling budgets, timelines, and community pressure. People who made a decision years ago that quietly snowballed into a conflict no one expected to explode. Assumptions on both sides had built the road to this entire dispute. And assumptions, I realized, are powerful things. The experience changed how I look at property rights, neighborhood disputes, and the idea of community itself. Owning land doesn't just mean having boundaries on a map. It means speaking up when those boundaries start to blur. It means asking questions early, even when things seem small or harmless. Because small things rarely stay small for long. These days, when I walk past the gate, I don't see a barrier anymore. I see a turning point. A moment when I stopped assuming everything would work itself out and started standing up for what was mine, calmly, legally, and firmly. And, strangely enough, life around here feels more peaceful because of it. The biggest lesson this entire experience left me with is simple. If you don't define your boundaries, someone else eventually will. So if you've ever faced a neighbor dispute, HOA conflict, property line issue, or anything that made you question where your rights begin and end, I'd love to hear your story. Share in the comments, tell me how you handled it, and let's learn from each other, because these situations happen more often than people realize. And remember this line, because it's the one I keep coming back to every time I walk past that gate. Silence feels easy in the moment until it becomes permission.